So here's a landscape photo that I asked a student of mine to paint, and here is their painting. And in this video, I'm gonna go through and critique their painting and then demonstrate what I would have done differently. And then at the end, we're gonna review by having a side-by-side comparison. Sound like fun? All right, let's jump on in. First off, if you're new to the channel, then welcome to Paint Coach. My name is Chris Fornatero, and I am here to help simplify oil painting so that you can get better faster. All right, and so this photo, no, I did not take this photo myself. I live in Florida where there are no mountains like this. When I do landscape paintings, I try my best to take my own photos, but when I want to paint mountains, I got to go and find my own photos. So I pulled this off one of those royalty-free websites like Pexels or Pixabay, I forget which one. But anyway, let's just jump on in to the student's painting. The first thing that pops out at me here is composition. Now, I actually made a whole video on composition. So if you want to take a deep dive into that, I'll put a link to where you can watch that right above right now. But the thing that pops out to me about their composition are these rocks in the foreground. They just act as a wall, keeping the viewer from entering into the scene. It's always helpful to have, something, whether it's a path, a river, like a shadow, a bush, just any kind of shape leading and pointing the viewer into the scene. Also, all the rocks here are the same size and shape. Whenever you have repeating shapes, you want to vary them up. This goes for rocks, clouds, trees, anything. Like, he has all these rocks and they all seem to be the exact same size and shape, which draws my eye to them in a bad way. Also, the shoreline here is vague and not clearly defined. And the river looks like it's more on a hill opposed to coming at us. And that's actually a problem of perspective that I'll address later on in the video. All right, now let's move on to colors. He actually did a lot of good things with colors here. He kept the trees here in the foreground darker, having more saturation of color, opposed to the grass and the trees in the distance. We want to always remember atmospheric perspective, which is as things get further away from you, certain colors drop out. First color to drop out is yellows, and then reds, and then you're left with blues. So the greens that he's mixed up here for these grasses are great. There's not a lot of yellow in them. There's more blues and reds, and they're also lighter, just setting them nicely in the distance. Now, I actually would have liked to seen more warmer colors used in these rocks in the foreground. All of the colors down here in the foreground seem pretty cool and not much different from colors in the distance. And these trees in the distance, I think, could be pushed even cooler. And what I think what happened here is that they got tripped up with values, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about. Now, value is how light or dark a color is. So I'm going to pop this painting into black and white so we can better gauge the values. Now, you always want to remember that in general with landscapes, there's going to be certain value planes. I've talked about this a lot pretty much in every video that I talk about landscapes, but that's because it is just so important. The thing is that your sky is going to tend to be your lightest value, followed by your ground plane, like any flat ground, and then any slanted planes like mountains or hills are going to be a little darker. Your darkest objects are going to be upright, things like trees, people, barns, things standing upright. Now, something you should be aware of when doing landscapes from photos is that photos can play with the values a little bit. A lot of times with photos, the darks are darker than they really seem, and the lights are lighter than they really seem. So I actually try to counteract this the best I can on my computer by making the lights darker and the darks a little bit lighter. I play with that a little bit. In the end, I'm just gonna have to paint what I know sometimes instead of what I see. Now, also with values, as things get further away, the difference in values between dark and light get closer together. So this tree close up here, the darks are going to be a lot darker than, say, the same kind of tree way back in the distance. Now you can actually see that the sky is darker than the grass, and that should be switched. And the lights of this tree, which are an upright object, and even though they are the highlights of the tree, they still need to be darker than the mountain behind it. So the darks in the tree in the foreground here should be darker than the darks in the trees in the background. But they're not. They're pretty close together, which is keeping them from looking far apart in space. Same thing goes for the rocks. You got these rocks in the foreground, and the dark shadows in there need to be darker than the shadows of the same kind of rocks further away. I mean, you can even see here that there's a dark in the mountain that rivals a dark in the tree. Now, getting values can be tough, and a helpful thing that you can do if you struggle with this is to create what I call a value map at the beginning of your painting. You can do like a wash painting with just, like some burnt umber and paint thinner and kind of map out the values. Make sure everything is working value-wise. That way you go in more prepared when you add color. All right, now the brush work. Now I can see in the tree, he used a lot of rigid, straight brush strokes with a flat brush. Now I'm not saying that you don't have to use a flat brush. Like I used a flat brush for my entire painting. It's just you need to turn it and use it differently to create a different variety of brush strokes. Think about what you are painting. Flat, rigid brush strokes is actually good for the rocks. I actually would have liked to seen more of that in the rocks below. Instead, he actually has some curved brush strokes, but using flat, jagged strokes can indicate the rocks a lot better. Whereas when you're painting things like leaves or pine needles, you know, these trees, you want more of an organic type looking brush stroke that, you know, doesn't repeat as often. I can do the strokes in the direction of the leaves, but you want to vary it up and not be so structured and rigid. All right, now it's time to demonstrate what I would have done. Now, the first thing I like to do is I like to tone my canvas. I use a wash of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue and some paint thinner. I brush it on, then wipe it with a paper towel, and it's ready to paint on right away. I do this because it makes it easier to gauge values right from the start. If I was using just a straight white canvas, every single value that I put on there would look dark because it's right next to white. All right, so now as I'm drawing this in, I am not being afraid to move things, to change things. This is a hard habit to break. It was really hard for me to break, but feeling free to change things to make a better composition. Like, I'm getting rid of all of these rocks in the bottom, you know, left-hand section of the canvas, and I'm opening it up and having a waterfall here on the right. Have the water flow off the bottom of the canvas. This is going to give the viewer an angled way into the painting. They're going to go up this water to this waterfall, which is going to lead them in there. I don't have all these rocks blocking them from entering the painting. Also, I am identifying the shoreline with horizontal lines that step backwards. It's just really helpful to think of the shoreline in terms of horizontal lines that step backwards. This is going to also help you separate the shore and the land into different shapes that overlap, and this is going to help create distance. Now, I'm going to start with getting the darkest dark in the painting. I do this for two reasons. One, I find it easier to work dark to light in terms of layering paint. It's a lot easier to lighten paint as you go, opposed to having to darken it. It's also pretty easy to get the darkest dark value correct, and then you can use it as a key for the rest of your painting. So if I get this darkest dark in, and I know that is my darkest dark, any other darks that I put into my painting, I can make sure that they aren't this dark because this is the darkest dark. So it kind of gives me a key for the rest of the painting. Some painters also like to do this with the lightest light. They'll first find the darkest dark in their painting, then they'll find the lightest light in their painting, and then they can use those as kind of like boundaries to know where all the other values are going to be at. Now, as I block in the trees here, you can see, you know, with my brush work that I'm not being very rigid. I'm being very loose with it, very general, because I know that I can come back in later with the negative space around the trees and cut back in and dial in the shape to what I want. Now, I actually started to work this painting in a way that some people call working inside out. You know, some people like to work from the furthest element in the scene and work their way forward. If you've seen any of Andrew Tischler's videos, he likes to do that. He'll start with the sky, then he'll move to the mountains and just keep moving forward in the foreground. Another way is just massing out the big shapes and getting all the big shapes in first. I've actually made a whole video about this. If you want more in-depth on that process, I'll put a link right here above where you can watch that. Now, this way of doing it is very helpful, I find, when you have a lot of different planes in the painting touching each other. Remember earlier I was talking about the different planes of a landscape, and you can see in this little section of the painting here, I have a upright object in the tree intersecting with a ground plane in the grass here, a slanted plane in the mountain, and the sky plane. And it's also intersecting, you know, with some other trees in the background. So there's a lot of different elements in the scene all happening right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work just this small section of the painting first and kind of figure it out, because I can hop around from one part to the next and easily compare them because they're right next to each other. So once I can get this little cross section of the painting working and getting the value and color relationships working to some degree, I can then branch out and use it as a key to fill in other sections of the painting. So as I'm working this little section, I'm constantly thinking about value relationships. What's darker than what? What's lighter than what? Color relationships. What's cooler? What's warmer? I'm always trying to balance those things out. Even after I move on from this little cross section of the painting, I'll still come back and I'll still make adjustments to these all the way up until the end of the painting. I'm always comparing relationships. For example, the darks in these trees in the background, it's kind of a purple right now, but as the painting goes on, I'll keep wanting to push them further into the distance, and I'll do that by adding a mixture of ultramarine blue and white. This is going to cool it down and sit it further back in space. Now, as I start working the foreground of the painting, I get some of this white water in the foreground down, and it's actually not pure white. I very rarely, if ever, go to pure white. I actually mix in a little bit of yellow ochre into this. I really want to save my brightest white until I really need it. But getting this bright white in here early is going to help me gauge values like I was talking about earlier. So getting this really light value, it's going to help me see things and understand where things are going to fall value-wise in other sections of the painting. Now, as I'm putting in the sky, I actually want to push this mountain a little further back. I want to separate it from these trees a little more. So I actually take some of my sky color and put it in at the base of this mountain to create a little more atmosphere to separate it from these trees. Now, you will hear a lot of writers say that all writing is rewriting. I feel the exact same way with painting. I feel like so much of painting is just repainting or pushing and pulling, as I like to say. Like, once I have the canvas covered, that is when the big changes start happening. You know what I'm saying? Like, oh, like what can I, what needs to be lighter, what needs to be darker, push this warmer, push this cooler, this needs to be simplified, this needs a little more detail. This grass here in the foreground, I noticed it was too light and I needed to make it a little bit darker. This grass in the distance was just too yellow. It had too much yellow. Remember, yellow is the first color to drop out in atmospheric perspective, and it just wasn't working. So I knocked it back with a little more blue and red into that green mixture. So I made that grass sit more in the distance. My darks in the distance were also too dark. I needed to knock those back a little as well. I also noticed that the shadowed side of my tree here was too flat. There wasn't enough volume being portrayed. So I pulled out a subtle lighter value within the shadows to give it more form on that side. All right, now let's review what we went over with a nice side-by-side comparison. All right, composition-wise, you can see how much easier it is as a viewer to enter the painting with this water and river, and you're not blocked off with this wall of rocks. The shoreline is built more accurately. It steps back into space a lot more using the horizontal lines that step backwards. Color-wise, the warms that I used in these rocks in the foreground, it wasn't a lot. It's not like these warms that I'm using in these rocks are like bright oranges and yellows and reds. It's a very subtle shift in color temperature, but it helps set these rocks in the foreground. And also, the warms in the waters, down here I use a lot more oranges and greens in the waters. And as it gets further back, just in general, like if you're ever painting a river, you're gonna see into the water down to the river bottom more the closer the river gets to you. As it gets further away, you're gonna catch more of the reflection of the sky. So as the river goes back further, it's going to be more of the blue being reflected from the sky. Also, my trees in the distance here are cooler, a little bit lighter. It's going to set those further back, give it some more depth. All right, value wise, I'm going to put these in black and white. And you can see mine is adhering to the value planes a lot more. My sky is the lightest value, followed by my ground plane. And then my slanted planes like mountains are a little bit darker. And then my darkest value are my upright objects like my trees and rocks here. My darks get less dark the further back in space we go. In brushwork, you see I used a variety of different strokes. I used more kind of rigid straight strokes in the rocks here, looser in the trees. Also, my brushwork gets a lot more simple as I get further back in space. I kind of save more detail, smaller brush strokes for up front. You're naturally going to see more detail up front, so that's another helpful thing that you can do to create depth in your landscape. Wow, you made it all the way to the end of the video. That must mean you really like it. And in that case, I suggest that you hit that subscribe button. Also, you'll probably like this video as well. And if you want to see what I'm painting on a daily basis, you can follow me on Instagram at Forza43. I'm Chris Fornatero here telling you to go get painting.